I'm going to help you level up your rendering by understanding edge control.
Stop right there, criminal scum. Nobody breaks the law on my watch.
First, we're going to recap the basics of lighting a form and understanding terms. Understanding terms to light are very helpful so you can consciously understand what you are looking at as you paint, draw, and observe your surroundings. We need to remember that everything we see is affected by light. With no light, we can't see anything. But as soon as we add a light, we have a light side to the sphere. This would be like observing a planet in space. We can also clearly see there is a line created as the form turns away from the light. This is called the terminator because effectively this is the dividing line between light and dark. Anything past the terminator cannot be seen by this light. However, if we place the object on a ground plane, we suddenly have a lot more information. With the ground plane visible, we now see bounce light up to the base of the sphere. This bounce light also creates the core shadow. The core shadow is still the darkest part of the sphere, but it's not a part of the terminator line because the terminator line, you can still clearly see, is where the light and dark sides are separated. The core shadow is just the darkest part where light has not affected it yet. We also see that a cast shadow is created. Watch what happens as we adjust the color of the ground plane, and the entire sphere is illuminated more brightly. Objects are affected on what ground planes they sit on. This would also apply to the color of the ground plane, as well as the color of its surrounding environment. As we adjust the black background to a more light blue color, you can see that it affects the shadow as well, because now the ambient light from the environment is affecting both the core shadow and the cast shadow. However, one place that is totally unaffected still is right below the sphere, and this is called ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion is effectively where light cannot reach. For example, when two forms directly overlap, two forms are touching each other, creases, places where it's just too difficult for light to get in. In summary, the most important thing to determine when rendering anything is your light source. The light source is going to determine the terminator and the cast shadow. The ground plane is going to affect bounce light, and the environment is going to affect the color of your shadows and the brightness of them. Now that we've reviewed the basics, I'm now going to show you how to manipulate those forms and push and pull on them to get some really interesting results and level up your rendering game. But first we need to understand something. We need to understand that changes in light are changes in form. So anytime something goes from light to dark, it's indicating that the form is turning away from the light as we reviewed in the basics. I'm gonna keep my tool set really simple for these demonstrations. I'm just using a soft round brush and we will get all the necessary results just with this single brush. So if you think I'm doing anything fancy, I'm not. I'm just gonna create a really simple scene, kind of like the one that I showed earlier with Blender. And for time's sake, I'm just going to use some selection tools because it'll just make my life a bit easier. Key light is right here. And we'll actually assume that it's not giving it full power, so we'll just make a nice matte result. Now in this demonstration, I'm not going to include the specular, which would be right around here, because effectively the light is coming from the light source and it's hitting the object about here, but what we see is right here to our eyeballs. But we're just going to ignore that. We're going to keep the object matte so it has no specularity. Here is my core shadow and terminator. I turned down my opacity a little bit, it's a little strong. There we go. Nice core shadow there. And remember that the terminator is exactly where the light terminates. So at the end of the terminator, the form starts to turn away from the light. So it's actually going to be the darkest point. But we also saw that as you introduce more light into the environment, you also get more ambient light, which is going to light up the shadow side of the object. We're going to light this up a bit. There's also bounce light coming from the front, although because of this gray, it will be a bit darker. We'll just keep this a little dark. It's not going to be totally black because remember, light is still bouncing from here up here. It's also going to be bouncing from here to here, and it's going to be bouncing from the back as well. So light is very active. It's not static. Get a little bit of bounce light here, and then for this guy, we're gonna just use a simple blur, the blur tool, which is one of my favorites. We're just gonna blur the edges here. Just a simple blur. show the light fall off as it moves away. The light fall off from the cast shadow, right? Indicating that the form is actually entering light. So light begins to spread and separate that distinct cast shadow a bit more, and it kind of blurs the edges. There's also going to be ambient light receiving in the shadow. So we can just gently light this up. We don't want to do too much. We want to gently light it up. And I'm just having my clipping mask enabled, so that way I just color directly inside the shadow. And then the darkest point is going to be directly underneath here. You probably heard this term, ambient occlusion. It's going to be right underneath the form like that. Actually, why don't we do a few examples. I'm just going to move these up just a bit, just for presentation's sake. Okay, there's a couple of really key things you need to understand about the way that light interacts with objects and what exactly you're communicating when you put strokes down on the page. Let's think of this in just a 2D simplified view. When you draw a form that's turning, like so, the same thing that's happening on this sphere right here is happening to this form as well. All the same things, cast shadows, terminator, all that. It's happening, it's just happening again. So effectively the way I like to think about creases and changes in edges is sort of like the light is restarting. So we had this really bright point here, right? This is the brightest point. And then all of a sudden it just restarts and the light hits and starts again right here. Now this is going to change depending on the strength of light and its fall off. But for the most part, this is how I like to think of it. So if we apply this to a sphere and we want to create a bump. Now, the most common way that I thought of this was when it came to human anatomy, because a lot of anatomy is totally dependent on overlapping forms. So if you have, like a deltoid, for example, using my MacLeod's horse brush from my brush pack, which is just a gradient brush with a slight texture to it, we can quickly get a lot of changes in form very quickly, and it starts to look almost like an arm. And the reason for that is because of this harsh change in edges. This really abrupt change right here, communicating that there is a massive form change happening. The light is wrapping around the deltoid here, and then it's restarting as it enters and conjoins with the tricep and bicep right here. So, on a sphere, what would this look like? On a sphere, we would get a result sort of like this, where I would come in and just chop away at the sphere. On this side like that, very carefully. You just want to make very slight, careful adjustments. And so really quickly you can get lumpy, rumply textures going across your sphere, but this is a really blatant, obvious example. And it's good to exaggerate so you actually understand what's going on. And although this would be in shadow, it would be catching some ambient light. And if the form was twisting well enough, you'd probably see it. There'd be a slight cast shadow, and the form would sort of bleed into itself a bit, like so. And we could even really push that for dramatic effect. I said I was only going to be using a soft round brush, and I lied to you. But you can get the same effect with a round brush. I just like this brush because it's a bit of a shorthand for some of the decision making. Anytime light is popping out from the side of the sphere, we're indicating that the form is heading towards us, because normally this would be in shadow. So if it's popping out a little bit and we can see it even in the mid-tone area, which this would be the midtones, right? Anything transitioning from light to dark are kind of your midtones, right? In this area, right along the terminator is where we can get a lot of detail in. Let's think about this real quick. Let's think really consciously about what we just chose to do. So what I chose to do is I'm telling the form that it is turning, then there's an abrupt stop. There's a stop right here. Then it turns again. Then there's an abrupt stop, and then a little wrinkle, and then, lumpy, or whatever. You have to think about shadows and rendering in terms of what the form is actually saying. We think about form as in really broad terms of like a cylinder, a cube, a sphere, but also note that textures are really just tiny forms that are on the object. And so they would follow the same rules of light. The way that I like to think about it, and it was sort of a brain blast for me, is just the light is resetting. If we were to take this sphere and rotate it and look at it from the front, from what the light sees, what we would see is a sphere that goes like this, right? Circle. And then right here, I am telling this that it juts out like that. So I just jutted out this huge chunk that kind of blends in. Every change in form or every decision with your light is indicating something about the form, which is why when something is poorly lit or doesn't look proper, it's because we know it's not exactly the way light would interact with it. Okay, the next one I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do a crease, like a belly, right? So like if the sphere was folding over on itself. And we're gonna learn a couple of things here. One, little changes like this, little small wrinkles are actually just little tubes. They're little cylinders that we just need to think about. So if I wanna indicate that there's a belly here, first I'm gonna create a big form. I'm gonna create a big form to know that the sphere is falling in on itself. The first form like this, and then the second form is also catching light. And then if we want to get those fine details in there, we're going to start really small. I have my pen pressure on for the size here, right? Really small, just draw little creases. And then I turn my pen pressure off, and I'm going to get a crease around this. And again, the light is resetting. So now we're gonna come back in with a lighter value. And then do it again. Go back and forth almost with light and dark, light and dark, light and dark. And we start to see that effectively we're creating ripples, right? The dark, it goes light to dark, it restarts, light to dark, restarts, and we're just doing it on a really fine level, like little lines of light and dark. That's all it is. It's really simple. And because it's turning in on itself, now the bottom part of the sphere is going to pop out a bit more, so we're going to actually catch a bit more light than we would normally down here. All right, and make sure our big forms are nailed. So we want to make sure these big forms read well, right? So just I kind of comb back over it with a larger brush to make sure that my shadows are still getting in there, right? And then we can kind of come back in. And this is just a simple round brush with pen pressure applied to the size and the what's called flow, or I guess in Calypso Paint it's called brush density. Now, something about this looks a little off, and what's happening is the silhouette is not following the form. So we indicated that the sphere is kind of crunching in on itself, but the silhouette of the sphere just doesn't indicate that. So I'm gonna take my liquify tool here, and I'm gonna start to pinch and pull on my sphere until it looks like it's kind of doubled over on itself like the drawing indicates, right? And we can kind of really push this in here. So remember that the silhouette has to follow the form. And now there's a new thing happening. We're gonna have a ambient occlusion pass right here at the base of this where light will not be hitting. And we'll probably get like a little bit of light here, you know, just a little bit, because the form is no longer totally faced downwards. It's now catching ambient light from around the environment. So unlike the sphere here, which is facing down, this is now facing up because we pinched it and pulled it. So now there's two planes here, one here and one here that are kind of catching light. But because this is a cast shadow, right, it's gonna be receiving cast shadow from the same direction, the same light source. We gotta keep our light source consistent. We gotta really know what we're doing here, okay? Can't just be willy-nilly this stuff. Gotta be big brain, okay? Increase mass, brain density. Probably another terminator here, right? Always got to remember where is the light terminating. Get a little ambient occlusion down in there. We'd get cast shadow here. Just blend this. I think this cast shadow or rather the bounce light here. It's really important to remember the bounce light is not going to be brighter than whatever ground plane it's on. Once again, just ask yourself the question, what is this showing? What am I communicating? What am I demonstrating when I draw this? I'm demonstrating that there is a tiny little tube here and here, and then a large form here that have wedged themselves in, right? So these areas like this are little tubes. So that would be a crease in the object. So what's a shorthand to quickly communicate that something is bumpy? Like the back of a frog. Would be either half of a sphere, okay, that's from side, right, little bump, or a little cone. A little cone that would get shaded. Remember, a lot of the detail for textures and all that stuff can be found in the midtones because light is just gonna effectively blow this area out. You wanna think in simplicity, so 2 tones here and here, and detail goes somewhere in the middle and it kind of gradates out. We don't need to see a ton of detail in the shadows and the light. We get it. If you can communicate parts of the form have texture on it, the brain will fill in the rest of the information. I'm gonna grab this and I'm just gonna start gently with a large brush, gently massaging this area, and slowly the brush is just gonna get smaller as I go. And I'm gonna take the light source into consideration, okay? So the light source is coming from this way. So I'm not gonna shade it differently. I'm gonna shade it consistently, right? And I can kind of just do this. You can start small and go big or go home, right? And I'm slowly getting smaller using my wheel. Start big, go small. And we're placing little tiny spheres on the form. And of course you can blend these in together so they kind of look a little bit more like they're a part of it. And then we can do the same thing. If we want to add a shadow side to this, we can bring the shadow here and just start adding little dots. And what we're looking at is the base of the sphere, or like how we shaded this sphere originally, we're looking at like the midtone for it. Sometimes I like to place just like a placeholder shape or shadow and then render it from there. So again, if I had large bulbs right on the midtone of the sphere, some large bulbous forms, I'd start with maybe the darkest part of it and slowly blend it back into the skin part of the sphere. And if it was large enough, it would catch reflected light. Now, this might be a little extreme, but just for demonstration's sake, you can kind of see adjusting the size of my brush as I go. And of course, if we wanted to, we could add silhouette to the sphere, which would really just help this illusion we're selling of light hitting this bulbous, pustuled creature. Still getting a lot of reflected light here, a lot of ambient light, so it's not going to be too dark. It's going to be reflecting off the top of the form now. Catching the back side of that light. And there you have it. 3 really simple ways to add detail and up your rendering level by simply thinking consciously about what the form is indicating. So I showed you how to do hard edges, like the changes in the forms of anatomy, or creases, like in the belly, or maybe a wrinkle in a skin somewhere, like maybe your armpit. And then also texture, how to think about texture. That texture is actually geometry we're placing on top of the existing form. It needs to follow all the principles of light. You need to think about key light, cast shadow, bounce light. All that stuff is still taken into effect when you add texture onto something. I hope that helped. I hope you learned something. If you did, give this video a like, subscribe for more content. Until next time, I'll see you in the next video. Make good art.